Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. And Anne-Marie, brilliant to have you here today. And to start with, please share with everybody who's either watching or listening who you are and the great work that you do.
Thank you, Alan. I'm grateful to you for inviting me, first of all, to be part of this. My name is Anne-Marie Mealey. I'm the Director for Catholic Mission at Leeds Trinity University. Having had a long career in academia at Leeds Trinity, I've also worked in the private sector as an Associate Dean Learning and Teaching. I'm now in this role, so I strategically lead the university's mission. And part of my job has been to try to bring the mission and values of our founders. So they were the Sister of the Cross and Passion and the Catholic Education Service into relevance for today's world. So bring it into the portfolio, bring it into how we operate as a university, and to frame it in a way that we can be proud that our university exists to do good in the world. And I'm sure there's no university that wouldn't say it exists to do good. But Catholic universities in particular have that mission because they were set up to widen access to education from the margins for everyone and to see the inherent potential in each and every person to be a light to the world. So the aspiration that we have for our graduates is that they leave Leeds Trinity with a set of skills that will be used for good in the world and not just for making profits. So it's a big task. It's going well. It brings me into contact with persons like yourself. I also do some writing and, some of my books and things. But the key thing is the message, isn't it? That goodness, ethics, values, different perspectives and worldviews are the way forward in a world that is seeking understanding and recovery from COVID and breakdown of relationships, etc.
Mm. So listening to you describe that makes me think about how, values has been grabbing a whole lot more attention than it used to. It seems to be quite a trendy topic these days. But actually, the root of what we're talking about is in religion, isn't it? Because religion used to be the way that we had our guiding light and guided us towards good behavior and good character. And that's what values is all about. So how do you see that relationship?
So I think it's quite interesting because probably since time began, people have had to reflect on what does it mean to be a human person. So ultimately, the reflection on what is ethical is shared by everyone. It's a reflection on human reason to reflect on human behaviors and who we should be because the other exists. So the classical tradition would have addressed that. Plato and Aristotle have a lot to say. Aristotle's examined life is that the life examined is the life to have. To work towards eudaimonia and happiness is not just material happiness. It's establishing peace in the society and working towards a goal rather than to have to be told what to do. The religious traditions have contributed as well, and they're very specific in some of the requirements. And I think we need to get to a place right now in society, Alan, where we have respect for whatever perspective we might draw our values from, that we have respect for also the religious perspective from which certain values of religious denominations are derived, even if they might be ones that not everybody shares.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about values, and I know you share this view, we are talking about the betterment of everyone in society. And that's one of the ultimate ones to have, isn't it? Respect and tolerance in a diverse world where all of the voices can actually come together to ask that shared question about what it means to be human. And so you asked specifically about maybe Leeds Trinity and our Catholic values. The values we have in our strategic plan, we have really discussed them at length with everybody. So we've come up with the dignity of the human person and the common good, solidarity and service are all deep rooted in the Catholic tradition, but they're also open enough for everybody to feel able to contribute and hold those values as part of what the university wants to do and be. The other thing that we've done is through the motto Education for Hope. So a lot of people have come to identify that now motto with me personally, but actually it's the motto that I came up with when I started my new job because I felt we needed a new chapter. We needed to bring people of all faiths together and of none to say, how can we push forward the university's values together? And so the concept of hope is very much at the heart of what education is about, because it's the hope that everyone's future can be better, and that the future beyond the walls of the university is one that is a light to others, to inspire them to do the same when they go back to their communities, and then that they will use their skills, as I said earlier, for good in the world of work. So it's almost like a ripple effect. You throw a stone into the pond and it ripples out into society. So that's ongoing work, Alan, and we're trying to share that with as many people as possible, and yourself and others, in the V20 and other groups. And thank you for your books that you send to me and the little notes of encouragement, because even in professional life, values really matter in terms of how we treat people, how we interact with those maybe we don't agree with, or even that we don't like. How do you conduct yourself in relation to others all the time? So I'm not trying to say I've got all of the answers, but it's an ongoing project of that reflection every day on who am I going to be in this moment or in these circumstances.
Yeah, and I'm imagining now that people that are watching or listening, many of them might be very jealous of you actually for two reasons. One, because you can hear how passionate you are about your job, but then secondly, because you're working with education put together with hope, and those two together, I can't think of many more inspiring concepts that you could combine. So lucky you.
Oh, thank you. I really hope nobody is jealous, because you know what, Alan? Jealousy and the behavior that is fueled by jealousy is one of the most destructive things I think we could have, I remember reading this quote once. I think it might have even just been on LinkedIn, which said, always clap for the success of others, because your day will also come. And before we started the recording, I think we need to share this with everybody. We were talking about finding your purpose and your own mission and sitting into the empowerment that brings. So I can assure everyone that a 20-year history in academia wasn't always this maybe dynamic and exciting, because sometimes you have to actually learn your craft. You have to study a lot in order to be confident enough to speak with no notes and no PowerPoints and no footnotes. I mean, if people don't realize, this is unrehearsed, everybody. So Alan can ask me anything. The old me, or me 10 years ago, Alan, would not have come onto your show. I would have probably said, Alan, thank you, and thank you for the book. I will read your book, but not come onto your podcast for the world to see. So it's a journey, isn't it? So if people are looking, going, how do I get there? I would say keep excelling in what you do best, and find the thing that actually brings your life alive. Find the flame within that you feel really passionate about. But one thing that is said about me as a leader is that my energy from my job can also be stressful. So I have to be mindful that that energy can actually disempower others at times,
Yeah,
because they're not as excited about this thing in the way that I am.
yeah,
So again, it brings us back to relationships, how we interact, behaviors. It's like a boss who's delighted about his latest or her latest thing, but everybody else is wondering, why are they doing that and what are they up
yeah.
to? So it's a full range of considerations, isn't it? But personally, I love it, Alan. I wouldn't do it if I didn't. It comes with challenges and many blessings too. Because some people will say, well, where are you going with this ethics and values and mission, when really what the world needs is a financial stability? Yes, it needs all of those, but the route to us finding that is a collective response to what we think the common good should be. And it includes finance. It's not like we're pie in the sky, not
Exactly.
realistic about how people want to live. So that's why we had our business ethics conference, which got a lot of traction, actually, even from people who didn't attend, because we brought together different sectors that maybe don't ordinarily speak to each other about one topic. And I think that was quite a risk as well, on the one hand, for me to say, right, I've brought all these groups of people together and to see where we go. But there was a natural convergence, Alan, by the end of the conference, that irrespective of any differences in views, that actually the common good is something worth working towards, and that behaviors, values, and ethics, particularly in the workplace and in how we construct and design academic curricula, like the business curriculum was just one example, but ethics needs to be in everything, if you ask me. That's vital. The irony is that in higher education right now, programs where ethics would be studied academically in philosophy departments or in theology departments, they're struggling to recruit numbers of students from A levels. So I think eventually we're going to have that strategic model where, as you rightly said, people are talking about ethics more than ever before, but our actual scholars are not coming up in the pipeline in the number that they would have been before, when ironically the environment is much more ripe for them to speak out into the world now than ever before. So
Yeah.
that's a challenge too, but exciting equally, because it means the academics have to speak out into the wider world. There's no other choice, and that's learning all the way around. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
I love your very practical, pragmatic approach as well. So all power to you. And now we're going to choose a ValuesJam card from the deck. So there are 60 cards in the deck. And how many piles would you like me to lay out in front of me to help us choose a card?
4, please. We're the 4th of
Four piles,
October.
okay.
Okay.
And so pile number 1 is on my left and 4 is on my right. So which number pile shall I choose?
4, please, on your right.
4. Okay,
Yeah.
and then we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 16. So a number between 1 and 16.
6, please.
6, is that your favorite number?
No, I'm hoping for the best that I can speak to
All
this
right,
theme.
well, how about this?
Okay. Forgiveness. Okay. Wow.
Now,
Okay.
for somebody who's studied theology, I would imagine you know quite a bit about this.
My goodness me.
So the
How
first
powerful.
question is, what does forgiveness mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Now, this is so powerful, Alan. I was not expecting that, but it's a really, really important topic, because actually, a lot of people will associate forgiveness with a religious theme. Forgive as Christ forgives, or forgive as, spiritual leaders advise. However, even in other areas like psychology, to not forgive or find a way of coping with what might have happened, especially where you feel aggrieved about something, that festers inside. And I think as a society, we need to get better at discussing these themes. I even feel like I'm speaking to you much more softly because of the nature of this theme itself, because we're talking about something has actually been broken that was there before.
Mhm.
And in the biblical tradition, I used to find this so interesting. When I was a student, we used to look at the Old Testament, and they would talk about a covenant was a promise or a relationship where there was a promise of some description. And if that were broken, it was a huge violation of what had been promised or agreed or entered into, that was now broken. And
Mhm.
so the hurt, the pain inwardly that can come from some action that was meant to happen in good faith and didn't, can be very deep. Moving on from that, forgiveness is a key thing, I think. And I also remember I did a lot of work on the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who he was a philosopher, but used to dare into talking about, is there God? Why does ethics exist? Ethics exists because of the other. And I remember a distinction that he made between, is it forgive and forget? Is forgiveness asking you to just have a complete amnesty and go, okay, Alan, you promised me this job or whatever, you didn't give it. I'm really hurt now. What do I do about all the good things that are still a part of the relationship we have with each other? Or do I just cut all of that and move on, forget you? Even though I will be somewhere deep down, whether I like it or not, hurting about something. And what he said is, amnesty might only be something we do where it's massive world events and we have to say, we have to start the slate anew. But he does not believe that we forgive and forget. You forgive and remember lest you forget. So, for example, if we were to think of it in terms of the Holocaust, a lot of forgiveness may have had to go into, what came out of the Nuremberg trials, what we still even when it comes up to Holocaust days, etc., how do we still have a narrative about this, and about the society right now? But actually, the remembering can actually be a social conscience or even an individual's conscience based on their experience, to remind them not to reenact the behavior that caused so much pain that had then to be forgiven.
Yeah.
So I suppose, Alan, in all, it brings us back to the importance of our values and ethics in the first instance. Because if we are persons of our word, whether that is written down in an official legal contract, or whether it's me and you saying, yes, we'll meet next weekend, or whatever it might be, that we honor that as much as possible in order to avoid having to be in the situations later on where people are damaged or hurt or separated and broken. And the other thing this reminds me of is the importance of remembering, even if the act is forgiven, because everybody learns from that, particularly if it is spoken about later on. So it's quite important sometimes to go back over old ground. I know sometimes we can say,
Right.
the trauma of something was so much, let me never go back there. But whether you do or you don't, you have to find a way of creating a new narrative from that experience. So old, new life for old, depending on how big the thing that needed to be forgiven is. And I'm a great believer, since I even remember where I was sitting in one of the libraries outside the Sorbonne in the Latin Quarter. Sounds so elegant and everything, but that's where I was doing my master's. And when I read it, I remember exactly what I felt. I always thought, particularly in the Christian tradition, it was forgive and forget or turn the other cheek, etc. But Ricoeur's view was, yes, you can have forgiveness, but that act of remembrance is an act of hope that it will never happen again,
Wow.
especially a global error or a global,
Yeah.
massacre. So a really traumatic experience for the world at large. So it was very interesting.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Like, that's such a big start to the conversation, which is great. And I've got two or three things that, yeah, you've prompted me to think about, and I'm interested to find out a bit more actually. So, um, the first one is around, you were talking about remembering rather than forgetting. It strikes me that the forgetting is the almost easy option. So it's saying, I'm going to forgive and then I'm going to forget, and so I'm going to move on. Whereas the braver approach is to say, I'm going to forgive, but I am going to remember as well. And I'm brave enough to live with that rather than push it away.
Hmm.
But that led me to ask a question, which is about, how do you find it more difficult not to hold some sort of a grudge if you are remembering?
I think that's the challenge, isn't it? That you might do, but that's where the ethics comes in again, that actually the point of remembering is not to continue to be
Yeah.
hateful. It's to enhance behavior for good. And we often hear survivors of different traumatic experiences after a long time. So I don't want people to think this is an easy journey. It could take years depending on whatever it is. It could be a small thing like, oh, you forgot to ring me. Okay, fine. Everybody moves on. It could be a large thing. Somebody's marriage is broken, somebody's working life is affected by behaviors in work, somebody's gaslighted in the relationship. It's everywhere. So sometimes survivors actually have a lot of power within the suffering that they've experienced, that they're remembering enhances the understanding of others to identify where that situation might need a preemptive action on their part. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying that has to be obligatory, Alan. I think some people carry pain and trauma in their life in such a way that it will always remain part of their story and not shared with anyone, and we respect that. But equally, for those who do speak out, some of the voices in our societies right now are people who have been through something quite big in their lives. And their act of hope in remembering, however traumatic it might be, actually lets everybody else know why this thing is not right or why this behavior is not okay. And the other thing I will say is, and I don't have personal experience of this, is restorative practices as often used in prison services and also between nations where there have been events that have caused trauma. We know actually across the world that how healing some of that has been, but it was a painful journey to that forgiveness. But it's often still remembered, isn't it? This happened, this is a part of our history. I think we find it difficult because the easy option, as you rightly say, is to forget that it didn't happen and that your new life is a completely blank slate. But no one's life is a blank slate. It's an
That's
ongoing
right.
journey and story. And if we can go within to try and figure out, well, who am I now? And I often wonder, and I put this out to people listening, I don't force my faith on anyone, but I do believe. So I often offer up, I think, right, I don't understand why this is happening right now, but let me wait on the answer in hopeful expectation. And there's somewhere to put it. I do journaling. I do a whole, people see this part of me in the public arena, but a lot of my time will be I'm in my journal, I'm reading my books, I'm taking what I learned from my books to write down in key points for the next week. I reflect back on the week I've just had. And if there was anybody in that week, and I didn't always do this, Alan, who upset me or was trying to, I felt deliberately block me in any way, which goes on in work, I just think, well, how do I need to adjust to that person's behavior now? And I read a lot of leadership books as well, by executive coaches like yourself, because I think our learning is everywhere from every discipline. How can I get better as a leader? It sometimes might be that I do see something that needs to be forgiven, but I choose to be an ethical leader such that I'll navigate the next meeting in a way that that behavior will be neutralized just by the dynamic of the meeting. So some of it is skill as well, when you depending on what context you go into.
Yeah.
But the act of remembering, I'm big on that now, but only since I read the work of Ricoeur and others, to just say that actually sometimes we do need, because if the whole of the moral tradition, whatever tradition way you want to look at it, through religious lens or philosophical only, it's a huge wisdom of a collective body of people who've contributed literature, learning, subject disciplines, all trying to figure out what is the meaning of life. And in that, what does it mean to be a human person?
Hmm.
And every day, if we could imagine, this is me and I'm this personality, and people compliment me on my energetic, passionate way. But I also know that some people find that difficult, and I will adjust. So what's positive can also be misconstrued as negative, and I have to forgive those people for saying, right, she's like this. That's actually who I am naturally. I'm not trying to upset anybody, but there could also be a way of integrating whatever might be irking that person
Yeah.
into what I do. It might actually that they want to be involved in what I do. And if you do, I'd much prefer that you said that. So it's constant skill, isn't it? That Alan will never stop developing.
Yeah.
Never, ever, never.
And the other thing from what you were saying earlier that struck me is that it made me wonder if people that are more honorable or attach more importance to being honorable, perhaps they find it more difficult to forgive because they find themselves in the mindset of, well, I would never have let that person down, by not making the phone call or not showing up at the meeting or whatever. So, are you able to throw any light on that space, that relationship between honorability and forgiveness?
A little bit, yeah, because personally, I think anybody who champions values has to be very careful that you're not sounding like you're preaching to people and that you're putting yourself onto a pedestal where you think you do nothing wrong. I actually think that if you do, though, have a sense of commitment to what you believe in, that you would never have done it, you need to actually be understanding that other people are on a different part of their journey. That's how I do it, Alan. That actually you could be here on your journey and somebody else is starting. And it's a free choice, isn't it? Being a certain type of person of character and values is a choice also. So one has to respect that maybe somebody doesn't want to make that choice. They want to put money first, or they want to put materialistic things or individualism at the forefront of their life, but they have chosen that. So, okay, once you've freely chosen it, you're responsible. So Alan Thomasay did a doctoral thesis at Leuven years ago that got congratulations from the board, and you've passed and you're wonderful. And he concludes his volume by saying, ultimately, if ethics is not considered to be imposed by an authority, but you say you want to choose to step into it and use your conscience for good, you're ultimately saying that you have a responsibility for the actions you take all of the time then yourself. So that person who is not doing what they're meant to do is responsible, but equally so are you for the response to what they've chosen. And that is still, we still have to respect everybody and not be too draconian, because we have a huge opportunity, I think, in society right now, Alan. The whole world wants to talk about ethics and values and making the world a better place, and that's fantastic. How we continue to drive that forward is going to be vital, because if it turns into just policies and procedures in our working environments, and everyone has to do it this way, and everyone, if you don't tick this box, you're out, we will lose the momentum that
Right.
is freely circulating. So I think we've always got to remember it's fluid. We've always got to remember that maybe more often than not we'll fall short of the mark ourselves,
Yeah.
everybody, even those who think they're on board, and that it's a journey towards, like even the ancients describe it as a journey towards a goal. It's
Yeah.
not actually, I have been good today because I spoke to Alan. It's, well, what am I going to do after that conversation is really what matters. No disrespect to yourself. Is that, well, is she going to do what she said she's saying to Alan in the rest of her life outside?
Yeah.
And we hold ourselves to account. So it's a process, isn't it? Always in the interests of others and self. And that's a huge conversation that's always happening within.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've just been delivering a couple of workshops over the last couple of days with groups of people about customer experience. And well, two key messages. One is that there is no silver bullet. And I think this applies to this area that we're talking about as well. And then the second big takeaway for them is to remember that it's the real world. And sometimes, so on the slide, it's SH star T happens. Sometimes things don't go the way that you expect or would like them to. But the only thing you can do is respond to the best of your ability, kind of get over yourself and get on with it.
Yes.
And if you do that, rather than beat yourself up for what's happened, because most of the time it's not you that's actually caused it, it's just what's happened around you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you were talking earlier about accepting people for the way they are, and I think there's another layer actually that I find myself being very curious about that sort of situation, because, and to use an extreme example, I even find myself thinking this way about terrorism, for instance. Because we're very quick to say, "Oh, they're terrorists. They're trying to blow people up or whatever they're doing." But I find myself asking the question, what is actually driving somebody to such extreme behavior?
Mm-hmm.
What must they be holding and dealing with in order for them to make a choice to do that to other people or property or whatever it is?
Mm-hmm.
And until we start to ask those questions and try and find out those answers, how can we be anywhere near understanding what we should do about it?
Yeah, I think the first step is where we started our conversation, to acknowledge that the ethical quest and the quest for truth is a constant reflection on what it means to be a human person. And some people's answer to that has actually got distorted somewhere along the line, Alan, either through pain, through being part of fundamentalists' interpretations of even texts that might be considered sacred texts. We have to be always in the process of learning, and always in the process of keeping in mind that to understand what is truly human is very profound. When we think of all the interpretations that show up in people's behavior and them thinking that is human for them and for others. And that's where we get into I used to ask a question of my students: is Adolf Hitler evil? We used to have the discussion on intrinsic evil. And this still worries me. And if they're listening to this when it comes out, they will laugh, actually, because I used to say, why is the class on intrinsic evil full and my class on virtue on next Friday is not? I think it's because there's there's a curiosity about, is there evil? Or, maybe movies have sensationalized some of that struggle between good and evil, but it is real. Intrinsically evil acts are rarely spoken of, but they are acts that are never good. So murder, for example, by definition is wrong. It's known as a tautological principle. So it's wrongful killing always, but you could kill in self-defense, etc. So it's very nuanced. But at the heart of all this is a discussion about, how is a person choosing to actually do things which we all know are just not good, and what's at the heart of that person. And recently, reading for Telly Tusi, was one of the Pope's recent documents. He says nobody is a throwaway. We shouldn't be a throwaway culture. And we used to have these fascinating debates with my students about, was Adolf Hitler evil? The whole of that person. And they would go back and research his life and find out that actually he was part of groups that were doing good in his youth. So is it, so I leave people with that question, because it's good to challenge yourself and to say, do you think everything about a person's stance in life could be evil? Or do you still, like you've framed it, Alan, you are already showing your hand in a way and said, I want to know what's going on at the heart of those individuals. And I think we all need to ask as a society, how are we being human, and to what extent, and challenge ourselves to, do I need to go a bit further to understand that behavior? And there's some behavior which does need to be just, it's not acceptable, but equally it's a person who has chosen to do that. So
Yeah. And what about if we take it to a societal level? Because this came up in a conversation recently about the extra measures that have been put in place in Afghanistan, for instance, around freedom of movement and behavior for women and young girls. And somebody might make a case for that being completely wrong and unacceptable. But my question is, who has the right to go in there and tell them that that's the case?
mm,
You know, that feels like an ethical dilemma.
mm. And I think that's where this gets very deep. That's where it does require expertise. That's where it does require governments speaking to each other, Alan, and policy. And also, there's the whole concept of cultural relativism, where that's a model of ethics where it's almost when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So certain cultural norms would actually be guiding the behaviors. So again, we're back to, I think, and I don't want to overgeneralize because it's such a complex area, but we are back to understanding. The part of our task is to understand where the moral tradition has come from, where this thinking has been either passed down or as part of cultural norms, how it could appropriately be looked at. But it's a delicate task, because in some areas we don't share the same values, and some people are actually okay with that and others are not. But it's finding that line, and this is where careful training everybody needs. It's not just that ethicists are ready even to engage in those discussions automatically. There's a way to dialogue, isn't there? All of us in society right now need help to understand what genuine communication on some of the most sensitive issues facing our society looks like. And there are experts in our working worlds who that's what they do. They train us to speak to each other. So that's why I always say we need multiple teams. And in no matter what discipline or what you think you're expert in, you need experts in other areas to navigate the more complex grey questions. The grey areas are the most challenging. So most people wouldn't disagree with where our conversation started, which was about, yes, values matter. Everyone would be like, okay, at that level. But once you start going into particular cases, that's where it starts to get very deep, complex, nuanced, and sensitive, and requires expertise across a range of disciplines.
Yeah.
And to come back to the university, Alan, that is also why often on the Beyond the Dark Clouds podcast, people will be saying, hear me saying, is every subject discipline engaged in ethics? Are they taking their learning and reflecting that into who they're going to be as a professional? Whether they're going to be a high court judge, whether they're going to be the next taxman, whether they're going to be in government, in the classroom, our children, with the future generations. everyone needs to ask those questions and to seek help and always be connected to the university as an alumni. I think that's really a responsibility, and to engage in lifelong learning, because your subject discipline, if it teaches you anything, it should teach us all how little we know, faced with the complexities of what life is throwing up right now and societies across the world, and that there isn't a silver bullet sometimes to find that answer. The number of times over the years, Alan, people used to say, "Is that right and wrong? Is that what you teach, right and wrong?" And I'd be always wanting to say, but I would hold myself back depending on how long I had with that person, because it might just be a cup of tea over something else, to go, okay, it kind of, but we'll come back to it. It's not as clear cut as that. The most difficult task is when we get to the gray areas, and where we get to, is this a Western view in a different context? Where is this framework coming from? And that humility to understand that in this discussion, there are multiple voices and multiple skill sets needed to even facilitate the
Dead
conversation.
right. And I don't want to get overly philosophical, but when you talk about black and white and grey, it also seems to me that sometimes people talk about those shades as being factual and a reality, whereas in fact, they're simply the perception of the person that's looking at the situation, which might be very different than the perception of another person that's looking at the situation. So that makes it completely confusing. Now,
Yeah.
in Values Jam, there's an opportunity for you to create your own question about forgiveness.
Okay.
So I'd invite you to do that now. So a question beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how. And if it's a question that you've got the answer to, then please feel free to share, or I'm happy to go first if you'd prefer to do that.
I'm interested in you going first, Alan, because I feel I've talked a lot today, and thank you for the opportunity. But it'd be good to listen and to. So
Okay,
we give out, but we listen too. So I think
so
you should start.
what's your question then?
So, Alan, in universities today, so I like throwing questions about universities out to other experts, especially leadership executive coaches, because we need that. So, in relation to forgiveness, do you think that is a concept that can help the university be a better place? And if so, how?
So do you know I've immediately gone to grades.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm thinking that I remember getting poor grades for papers at university, and I remember how disheartening it was and how ashamed I felt. And so I'm thinking that if my professors had been more forgiving and more focused on how I could improve, and that my performance in the past wasn't necessarily much of an indication of what I was capable of in the future, then I might have performed at a different level in that space. Um, so that's just an initial
Yes.
reaction. What are your
Yes.
thoughts in that space?
Well, first of all, in relation to what you've said, assessment is the biggest single thing that students talk about in higher education,
Okay.
that it's not clear, that they didn't know, etc., etc. And having been an associate dean for learning and teaching and written a book for new lecturers, I think what you've said is just another sign to the academy that we also need to be telling people what they are good at, even if that's outside of the official assessment, that we're not assessing the person ever. We're assessing the piece of work that is aligned against learning outcomes, and the student is guided towards that assessment task. But how we grade and the feedback we give is not meant to leave an indelible mark onto a person that years later they're still talking about, but that actually it gives a hope that yes, there's areas for development, which even in our working lives, our review will always have areas for development. So anyone who thinks I don't have areas for development, I do. Even my positives can be construed as a negative by some. So we do. But that doesn't come across in such a way that there's no hope, or that we're saying that grade is so symbolic and powerful that it's going to determine where the rest of your life goes. It is one grade in a set of a program. We all have had modules where, if students are listening, where we weren't good at that particular module, but we excelled in others. And we need to find that balance, don't we? I think we need to be much more open with people. What are we assessing and why? And that actually, although students want anonymous assessment because they worry about us knowing them, the jury is still out with me as to whether it would still be nice to have the oral exam back, meeting people like this to discuss, well, what did you really learn on your program? And, and that's kind of times gone by. I had exams like that in Paris and in Belgium. And yes, they put you on the spot a bit like this, but you can really tell as a professor what a student knows in the overall
Yeah,
conversation.
I'm finding I've got a kind of physical reaction against that suggestion of dehumanizing it completely because we live in a human world.
Mm,
And so I think the real answer is to establish enough trust in the level of human involvement rather than take it away. I think that would be a terrible thing to do.
yeah. And in relation to forgiveness, Alan, our societies are becoming really diverse, which is brilliant. The world is now in our universities, which I think is brilliant because even if you don't have the money to go to Brazil, to go to Nigeria, people from these countries will be in the university
Yeah,
right now,
yeah,
in your campus. So I would encourage everybody to say, right, okay, don't be resentful that you can't or somebody can't give you the money. Forgive all of that, circumstance, whatever, and look for the hope of how can I engage with other cultures, learn about the world, and I'm still in my university campus. And actually, it will be serving multiple purposes, making the international community feel at home here in the UK and making the campus a safe space where everyone is respected and they are, seen as important and a vital part of the lifeblood of that campus. So, we can't always say, well, I can't go to this place because they won't give me the money or I can't. Let's also try and help people to find other ways to celebrate what is actually here and tap into the potential that's all around.
yeah.
So,
And with technology today, we were talking about it earlier that
yes,
you've done amazing work at the university to connect you and everybody else there with people on the other side of the world, all
yeah,
around the world. And
mm,
talking about students, I don't see why that couldn't be lifted and shifted into primary and secondary education. So imagine a child in a school in Nigeria, in Brazil, in Thailand, being able to engage with each other and
yes,
having a window into the world of somebody else in a different culture, a different society, in a different place geographically.
yes,
And that might help us actually avoid this tendency to exist in our bubbles and not really have much appreciation of what's happening out with those.
yes, yeah.
So we need to wrap up now because I'm conscious and I want to respect your time. So
Thank
the
you.
question at the end of a values jam is always the same, which is this: what are you encouraged to do differently about forgiveness as a result of our conversation?
Wow. Alan, I think I need a month to think about it and come back. This is almost unfair as a question. Talk about the exams for students. Anyway, I think right now, even though my answer when I go away and think about it might be that I need to encourage more of our students to tell us how we can get better and to also have a forgiving attitude for things we may have got wrong at the university, that it's not personal. It's not that we're trying to do things onto students. It's not that we're trying to be all distinguished professors in areas and not care about the next generation. I've yet to meet an academic actually who did not care or who did not want to make a difference in the lives of their students. But the forgiveness I would ask students to have for us is not to say everything's okay, but to actually forgive some of the things because we're on the journey to getting that right. And actually, I would also ask lecturers to be forgiving when sometimes they might get harsh feedback that they weren't expecting, that because maybe that has come about because the environment was not conducive to the honesty. We're back again to how do we talk honestly to each other? How do we really engage in what might be sticky situations or difficult conversations
Yeah.
about getting learning and teaching as good as it can be? And that we have those. And most universities are in those conversations, but there's always the odd time where you think, really? They said that about me? And
Yeah.
now they've gone on and graduate? I wasn't expecting. Wow. I would just encourage people to have those conversations while you're at the university, because that can be adjusted very quickly once you tell us. And that we
Okay.
see that as a positive dialogue where everyone's forgiving. Maybe there was a small, slightly, not great thing, but it's not insurmountable.
Okay.
Sometimes identifying where we're going wrong is the key to getting much better
It
at
is.
it.
And for an answer that you said, "Oh, I feel under pressure,"
Yeah.
that was a really strong answer, I think. So I guess I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, which is if you think about encouraging students to be more forgiving and maybe lecturers as well, when might you have the first practical opportunity to do something concrete in that direction?
So I don't lead learning and teaching at the university. I lead our values and mission, our Catholic
Yeah.
mission. But I think what I might do is have a conversation with our professor of learning and teaching and see whether
Yeah.
that's part of some event we could have, and that we link it to ethics, because
Yeah.
my book on introduction to successful teaching in higher education, the lecturer survival guide, was my way of saying to the upcoming generation of academics, you need to have a set of values in your classroom. And some of those values are that actually our classroom should reflect the ideal society that we would like to see. That's the essence of the book. So that our values of, yes, this might be difficult, but I want to hear what you have to say about assessment. It's the single most controversial thing. I will never go off the agenda, which is great.
Yeah.
But we're on that constant journey to get it right, Alan, because how everyone receives information, you mentioned it earlier, can be different. A lecturer might not actually think what they've said is, oh, you've said that
Yeah.
about my work. This is horrible. You're horrible. They might not think it's that at all. They might think they've really thought it through. And equally, a student might be misreading. We have to teach students how to read that assessment. I don't mean literally read, but interpret any language that might be, technical within that. And this is an ongoing journey. And so there might be opportunities as well in some of the work that I do at the university around ethics and values. We have a racial justice event coming up soon for students, and it might actually be that we, as part of that, incorporate that there are these aspects in racial justice need to also be brought up in the whole of the curriculum, which they are at Leeds Trinity, but it's a joining up of events into the whole. So I think what I'm going to do is talk to our learning and teaching people, try and incorporate maybe that values piece a bit more. And I would encourage others to just keep suggesting things to us at Leeds Trinity, because you mentioned the network I've now got. Alan, I wasn't expecting that, because I just wasn't. I thought, my goodness, how am I going to do this job? It never existed before. And will I be able to do it? And all of that narrative was going on inside, even though I was getting on. What did they say? Face the fear and do it anyway. So that was what was happening at the start. But now the connections that we've got, I'm just so grateful. And the suggestions and the network, including yourself, is the way forward for everybody to be thinking about, what are you good at? What message do you want to bring the world yourself? And I think if it's authentic, people see that and they come around to want to help you.
Dead
So
right.
it's something I just leave people and say thank you to you, Alan. When you sent me your book, I almost couldn't believe it was you that had sent it personally. But thank you. No, seriously, thank you. Thank you very much.
And my answer to the same question about what I'm encouraged to do differently is quite short, but it's about self-forgiveness. So I think sometimes, and there's two levels to this actually. So first, personally, I tend to be very critical because I want to do things really well. And so I think this is a good reminder of being forgiving to self. But that example of the student that's maybe not done such a good piece of work, I think there's something about encouraging others to be forgiving to themselves. So that might help them to understand that that piece of work is done and it's finished and they're not able to do anything about it now. So forgive yourself if that's the way you want to look at it for
Mhm.
getting a D grade or whatever it is, and use that as motivation and channel your energy to what you're going to do in the future rather than that energy be consumed worrying about and criticizing and why did I do it so badly. So it strikes me that that might be an interesting way to create a more positive outcome of not such a good piece of work.
Exactly.
So,
And for those who do have a faith, they have to be reminded that when God looks at you, it's an all merciful God. And actually, certain religious traditions, we know we haven't been great at emphasizing the hope that and the positivity that the gaze of God can bring to your life. But that isn't about the God of judgment all of the time. Actually, you are a created child of the Most High, and therefore that's positive all the way through, no matter what's happening. So people should, I would encourage them, Alan, draw on. You began by asking me where are the sources of people's understanding of truth. Engage with your tradition, engage with where that comes from you, and draw sustenance from it as you move forward positively with your life. And find others, like, look how we connected with each other and it continued from there. And be brave that actually sometimes what other people see of us is much more positive than what we're seeing within ourselves.
yeah, yeah.
So, we've got to keep going there into that space, however intimidating it sometimes might feel, like they pick a card and just ask you to talk for an hour on that topic. But Alan, I've enjoyed it. But
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining. That's a brilliant finish to our values jam, and I have to ask you to forgive me for taking 2 minutes more of your time than we agreed.
that's fine. I forgive you and keep in touch.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye,
Bye.
Anne-Marie.